Yeah, and we'll just figure it out because 5 minutes on any of these topics feels like you barely have even begun a sentence on it. But
Yeah, time goes fast when you're not thinking about it.
okay, so last time we did an episode we're going to call "What is Theosophy," and we did just kind of a overall view of some of the sort of the main things that come up when you think about the question of theosophy and what it is, where it comes from, the Theosophical Society and Blavatsky and all of that. So we gave a good overview of that. And throughout that conversation, we started to touch on a handful of ideas. We talked about Universal Brotherhood as an example. We sort of gave a touching point on a few core ideas, and then that spurred us ahead to think of what we do for episode 2 and further on after that. And what we're going to try to do now is we're going to try to do a little bit of an overview of some of the main theosophical ideas or concepts that come into play. So we're going to do these in an order that hopefully makes a little bit of sense, starting with sort of highest metaphysics and out from there down to things that are a little more right in our face as a human in this life. So we're going to start off as going to be way up in the clouds, and we'll come down from there.
HPB makes that distinction. You have physics, metaphysics, and sometimes she goes beyond that. Hyperphysics.
Hyperphysics. I like that.
Hyperphysics.
Well, it is interesting because when you go to different systems, different, religious, philosophical or spiritual philosophical traditions in the world, everybody has sort of their ceiling that they go to in their own metaphysics. And some
even
systems,
in science,
even in science, exactly.
The Big Bang.
So, yeah, we have exactly. There's some limit, and we don't go past that. And some of the Eastern systems, for instance, go up to these higher levels of metaphysics, and then Blavatsky says, "Yeah, but you could go a little bit above that still." So there's this kind of ever receding higher metaphysics, right?
Yeah. No matter how far you push it, there is always that idea that corresponds a little bit to that idea of the horizon. You reach a certain horizon in terms of perspective and understanding. There is always a beyond. And in that sense, that wouldn't be a definition of what is referred to as the absolute, for instance. But, that's the limitation of language at the same time, but it is the always beyond, you could say. And of course, HPB very often in terms of that subject of the absolute or the one life, and sometimes she equates those two, and sometimes she makes a distinction. But I think she's very often talking about what is referred to as absolute, and you find that also in other philosophies, as what is referred to in Hinduism as Brahma or Brahman. But then in another place, she says, well, that's actually the first logos. And yet it is still referred to as the absolute, because we mentioned that last time. You can speak of the summum bonum, the highest of what is possible in a system. And you can say, well, that's absolute. But then there is always the horizon that recedes, because our perspective of the summum bonum is specific to a specific system in which we evolve, of course. I think that's a very important definition there. And that doesn't mean that there's two absolutes, of course. The absolute that's always beyond the isness of things, you could say, and even that's not entirely philosophically correct, but what can you do, is different from that which is reachable in any given system. But the reference is to the word absolute, but they're not the same. And so there's only one absolute, that which always receives.
Yeah, and I feel like that is a really good place to start when you're getting into theosophical metaphysics, is to just get that under your belt kind of right away, that distinction. It's a really important one. And you can see if you don't get that distinction down, then you can end up in all kinds of problems, philosophical problems down the road where things aren't lining up very clearly. And that, the horizon analogy I find is really powerful for people to get that idea, because you can imagine yourself sailing a boat on the ocean and you see the horizon. And the cool thing about that is, where the horizon is. You can even measure the distance to it.
It's about
And
5 miles.
there we go. And so you know that the horizon is there. You can mark that place, and then you go to it. You arrive at that place. So you've arrived now at the absolute, let's say. And then there's a horizon farther out. So you are arriving at something that for you was absolute, and yet there's further. And that concept is really important.
Yeah.
And that's,
She even applies that to that word atma, yeah? Because sometimes she says it's a ray from the absolute. Whereas I think it's in the key to Theosophy where she says atma, or the absolute. So, but there's two different connotations of the same word there, and that's important.
Yeah, exactly. And that's partly where I like the term the one life that she brings in, because as you pointed out, sometimes she just makes an equivalent between absolute and one life. She just treats them the same way. But a fair amount of the time when she's dealing with the one life, it's something a bit more approachable for us. So it's more like the absolute of a system that you can reach to. So it's something that at least we can kind of bring ourselves to,
Yeah,
or at
it's
least
closer
conceptually.
it's closer to a human connotation.
Yeah. And then it
Otherwise,
helps.
it's just metaphysics out there.
And this is where I think some people, there's an article HBB writes where she pushes back at people saying like, all you're talking about is metaphysics. And she makes a few points in there that are really valuable. And one of the things is that, people tend to devalue the really highest metaphysics. Well, it's too abstract. It's way like, what does that have to do with my life? But when we take in that term, the one life, that starts to bring it to a point where we can make a connection between that and ethics. And that's where, the first object of the Theosophical Society was universal brotherhood. And one of the things that William Quan Judge says about brotherhood is that it's a fact in nature. It's not some idealistic thing. And we touched on that in the first episode. The reason it's not an idealistic thing is because of these high metaphysics. So you get the metaphysics under your belt, you get some understanding there. It changes the nature of what brotherhood means, or what solidarity, or whatever other words you want to use, mean.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's in Theosophy, it's not good enough to just be good. You also need to know the reason why. And those reasons are on a metaphysical level. So the more you understand the metaphysics of unity, you could say, the more you're going to understand the why being good and why not being bad. So in that sense, you could say ethics is applied metaphysics. That's a statement that you can make.
Yeah, exactly. And so we start with something like the absolute. We get a bit of a concept of what that means to us from a human perspective. We bring in terms like the one life, which kind of, then we can say, okay, well, there's all these lives. All these lives are collectively actually one life. So there isn't these automatic distinctions. In some religious systems, there's the good guys and the bad guys right from the start. In Theosophy, that's not really a thing. Everyone is part of the one. Every unit is part of the one. So we get that. And then brotherhood becomes obvious, that we're not separate from each other and all of that stuff, right?
Yeah. And also, we have to understand that level that we're talking about, it has a practical level. I mean, look at our daily life. We are all dependent on each other. I mean, you may not be the one who bakes the bread. You're not a baker. You're doing something else, but we all contribute to what we call a society, which is a very low level representation, actually, of that one life. Of course, on a metaphysical level, it's like true unity, but still, we operate in time and space. When we talk about those high metaphysics, it's beyond time and space. That's a major distinction to be made as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not like the absolute is somewhere doing something. It's not in time, it's not in space. So we're really, what we're doing with the metaphysics is we're building a kind of conceptual framework of what existence is built upon. And really the kicking point of space and time coming into effect is several steps down in the metaphysics, so to speak.
Yeah. And
Which
some people, some people will make the argument or the comment, yeah, but it's all just concepts, you know. But well, the moment you open your mouth, it's conceptual. I had a friend of mine one time complaining to me, well, you with your theosophy, you know, it's all just concepts. He said, I don't believe in concepts. I said, well, that's a concept too. So what else can it be? So, but
exactly.
it doesn't mean that we're limited to that, of course. It's just a framework in which our intellectual mind works. But of course, even in Buddhism, you find that you go beyond conceptuality. And maybe from that perspective, that plane itself that you're referring to, that may still be a concept on that plane. Who knows? You know?
Yeah, and in that sense, theosophy is very pragmatic as a philosophy. It's not trying to uh it's not trying to just land you in metaphysics land and have you sit there. It's like there's a purpose to learning those things, and the purpose is the application. And so actually, everything we talk about in philosophy in general, is from the human perspective. It's the only perspective we have. And so we operate from that perspective. We get a conceptual framework from that perspective, and that helps guide our actions in the world, helps guide how we treat people and all of that. So the metaphysics has a purpose beyond just, enjoying the intellectual exercise of it.
Yeah. But an important distinction that also need to be made here is that very often for people, abstractions is, that's something in the mind. It doesn't really exist. Whereas in theosophy, we say that the higher you go into the abstractions, the more real it becomes because we're dealing with planes of consciousness.
Mhm.
And we are apparently operating in our system on one of the most illusory aspects. So that you can say from the perspective of the absolute, which is mentioned in theosophy, everything is Maya, everything is an illusion. But then you also have to define illusion, and that can be done in different ways as well.
Exactly.
Because one way of defining it is that if it has a beginning, it automatically has an end, and therefore it's not permanent. So impermanency is an aspect of that Maya or illusion. Or you can say what we perceive with our senses always falls within a certain range of capacity to perceive. So those limitations also prevent us from seeing what is really there.
Mhm.
Well, that's also an aspect of Maya. And there's probably a few more that we can discuss later, of course.
Yeah, and that's a good point to sort of have that inversion where, our materialistic mind, the way we tend to approach everyday life, is that this is real. This here, these hands, this I can touch things, those are real. And the things we have in our mind, the ideas or abstractions or concepts are not real. And in theosophy, including like in all Eastern systems of philosophy and metaphysics, that is inverted the way you describe. Okay, so let's move on to the second one. So this is sort of, we touched on the absolute one life and quickly tied that into universal brotherhood, which we did in the previous
And
episode a bit as
ethics,
well.
yeah.
Ethics overall are going to emerge out of that analysis of unity, the understanding of unity. All ethics are going to come out of that. So after we analyze or build a conceptual idea for the absolute, then we start to explore what the next sort of metaphysical step is. And again, that this isn't a step in time and space. It's not like you move from the absolute to something else. It's just a next step of analysis or conceptuality of the absolute. And that's when we get into fundamental duality. We get into the two and the three. So we get into a fundamental duality, and then we have a third factor that comes in. So do you want to touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, first of all, we have to understand that the absolute is not the beginning of something. It's like a metaphysical beginning, but it's not that it is subject to cycles or time or something like that. It's out of time. So how do we move then actually into what you could call manifestation? And that is more a matter, not so much as a beginning of something, but rather a change in perception. HPB points that out in her first fundamental when she says, once we step away from this idea, well, yeah, it's very hard to explain. And, sometimes she refers to it as radiation, just like the sun radiates light, but that light is still the sun in a certain respect. So you have to, once you step away from that which is undefinable, you can't define the absolute. You have to start with something that gives you the beginning of something. And that's also in Theosophy a very high abstraction, which is actually what you could call potentiality. And that potentiality, even on that high plane, is still represented by lack of a better word, beings or powers or hierarchies. So you got to start somewhere. And in philosophy, it's usually referred to as a logos, like in Plato. And then you can make distinctions between levels of the logos, first, second, and third logos. In Hinduism, they have two, Brahma and Brahma, but then Brahma splits in male and female. So you actually also have three logoi there.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, those are all subjects to consider then, of course.
And that split of male and female has its roots in how we can perceive the nature of the absolute. And in a certain sense, it's sort of us superimposing what we experience in the world onto the absolute, in the sense that we say, well, around the world, we perceive this thing always present. Therefore, that thing must in some way be built into the absolute, so to speak, or come out of the absolute. And we have that with that fundamental duality of male female. On one side, we have sort of, you could say, the female side is sort of the substantial side of reality, and the male side is the spirit side or consciousness side of reality. So we have this idea of the absolute as like one, and then we immediately, when we start sort of conceptually analyzing it, we immediately recognize that sort of embedded within that one is a duality. And it's not a duality that are two separate things. It's not like there's two separate realities. It's two shades of the same thing, but we notice,
polarity.
a polarity within that one, right?
Yeah. And even so, between, on the one hand, posing something that is totally undefinable, the horizon that always recedes, and then the world of duality, there is still that thing in between that is non-dual and that contains all those potentialities. When they manifest, then the concept of duality is something that does not exist so much out there, but in our mind, And therefore, but she does say it in her first fundamental that spirit and matter are the essence, she says, of the manifested world. So in that respect, you can talk in a certain sense about spirit distinct from matter or substance and vice versa. But in reality, they are one. And that is that middle point between the absolute and the differentiated world as we perceive it in duality. And especially the use of male and female, those are anthropomorphic conceptions that we add to the idea of polarity that exists as a potentiality. It's a reality on its own plane, even. But on our plane, we see it as totally distinct elements.
Yeah, exactly. And so you can kind of follow through this mental process that we go into when we try to build a conceptual framework of these high metaphysics. Is we start off with that ever receding horizon. There's the absolute per se that is unreachable, undefinable, and then there's the absolute as a kind of apex, the one per se, and then you've got the two, which is that we recognize that in reality, no matter where you are, how you're experiencing reality, it's built on a kind of duality. There's always light and dark. There's good and evil. There's up and down,
Big,
left and right. Right.
big and
Everything.
small, good and bad, you name it. There's an infinite amount of dualities, of course.
Exactly. Yeah. So then we can extract from all the duality that we perceive to a kind of principle of duality. We recognize that that's built in. And then there's a three. And so what you also recognize is that between, so to speak, between those two dual sides, between the male and female or between the spirit and matter sides, is a kind of connecting link. And we can define that connecting link somewhat independently. In Theosophy, we have words like Fohat. But we're kind of getting to the point where you recognize energy. And so you can kind of say, okay, in Theosophy, you have this triangle or triad, this fundamental group of three, which is that you have this polarity and and that which connects the polarity. And in common terms, you could say, well, you have consciousness, energy, and matter, or consciousness, energy, and substance as like three fundamental principles of reality.
And yet they're still one.
And yet they're one. And this is where Theosophy differs from a lot of systems in modern science, because the inclusion of consciousness or spirit as a co-eternal reality with matter is different than our materialistic scientific approach. Right.
Yeah, and those are subjects that are discussed, like in Buddhism, for instance, or in Hinduism, with regard to meditation, that it is possible to acquire that level of insight that transcends space and time, what you can refer to as logos. I'm not going to say first, second, or third. That depends on how far you can penetrate into reality. But so they're not just abstractions, because we are confronted with duality. So there has to be something that transcends that dichotomy, you could say. And also an important aspect of the whole of manifestation is that once differentiation sets in, of which duality is the fundamental essence, we're not talking actually about things separating from each other. I prefer to use the word distinctions. Just like, and I always come back to the same example. My arm is not separate from my chest or from my shoulder, but it is distinct. You can name it as a distinct element, but it's not separated from each other. And that counts for everything in manifestation, that fundamental link always remains in effect. So in that sense, it goes even so far to say that if you refer to that one life as an ocean, the drops that are coming out of them, that ocean is still present within each drop. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's a famous and perfect analogy for it, or metaphor for it. So what we do here then is we sort of sketch out. So in Theosophy, what you'll find is a kind of sketching out of those metaphysics. So we're starting with the absolute, the fundamental duality, and there's a lot to be said about how we could understand spirit and matter and so on. Bring in the energy part, which is in Theosophy, you have that word Fohat, that can tie into that. And so now you have this sort of metaphysical view of, you could even kind of say like the substratum of the reality that's going to emerge. And then you have to start with, from that point to when things start to happen, so to speak. So now we have kind of an awakening of process that starts to occur. So nothing is occurring in what we've been analyzing so far. That's just getting our mind around the kind of basic structure. And then something is going to occur. And that brings out a whole different thing. So that is where we get that kind of the emergence of logos that you brought up.
That's
and then we get a few things kicking in. Yeah, go ahead.
It's a good word to use, that the emerging of, and of course in Theosophy we find quite a lot of details with regard to that. How you call that? that perspective. But it is very complex, of course, because what is it that is actually emerging? Well, it is that potentiality that emerges. And then at first, it appears still as a unit. And then it divides itself. It becomes distinct, not separate from each other. But then when we speak of consciousness, and I would rather say substance rather than matter, it's not just an abstraction. So we have to come to, you could say, the recognition of the emergence of forces that manifest out of that unity, and that becomes fundamentally a sevenfold representation of that unity. And that is true for what she calls the first, the second, and the third logos. Each one of those three is sevenfold. And those powers, she points that out in her transactions. People will say, yeah, but those beings that are beyond us, and that which is then beyond the beings, how do you refer to it? And she says, well, best thing we can do is refer to powers. But they're actually, you could say, entities on their own plane that carry the initial, you could say, emanation of differentiation. And then it starts slowly to differentiate more and more in eventually thousands of different differentiations until you end up with your rocks and your plants and your species in every kingdom, you know?
Yeah, and that's one thing that's good to start on with this part is that, the theosophical view of how everything comes to be is a doctrine of emanation rather than evolution, which is, there's an important distinction between emanation and evolution, but it's an emanational system. And the idea is that you have sort of at that emergence or awakening moment, so to speak, you have an initial emanation, and then all of those emanations emanate, and then all of those emanations emanate. So you get this building out process. You start with sort of you go from 1 to 3 to 7 as a very basic sort of mathematical formula to it, metaphysical formula. And then everything is going to keep, like you say, keep differentiating, continue to create further and further and further distinctions until we have the kind of system that we observe all around us. But that's a long process. That's a big process.
We see billions of forms and entities around us in all species and all kind of varieties. But like you say, that it's not even a matter of millions of years. It's a matter of billions of years before we come to the condition in which we find ourselves now. But another important element there is that the consciousness that is represented by those original emanations is way beyond our conceptual consciousness. And so the statement in Theosophy is that consciousness cannot manifest unless there is a vehicle through which that consciousness can manifest itself. And so for that reason, that principle of emanation happens through different planes of existence. And on each plane, we have vehicles that, you could say, the highest vehicles that represent that consciousness would be to us like nothing. Not even nothing, just nothing. But we make that distinction also in Theosophy between nothing and no thing, because a thing is something that applies to our perception, but there are things that are beyond our perception. If you would speak in HPB's time of galaxies, they would laugh you away. There was only the Milky Way. Until in the 1920s, we finally, through stronger telescopes, discovered that there was something beyond our perception. Why not apply that in an abstract sense as well? That there are existences that drop out of our range of perception, but they have their existence on their own plane. Just like when you dream, you exist on a different plane with your consciousness. or deep sleep, and so forth and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. There's a couple of other things that come up when we talk about this sort of awakening or emergence, or sort of the moment in which processes start to occur. Entities or beings start to awaken and their consciousness starts to become active and so on. But there's lots of ways that we can talk about it. But there's a couple other things that kick in. One is law kicks in. The idea of law that becomes the laws of nature, let's say. And in Theosophy, we would say, well, the primary or first law, or the first thing that kicks in, we would call karma. You can even think in the most abstract sense of like the law of causation, right? So karma kicks in, Maya kicks in, what you talked about earlier. So now we have the emergence of temporary things. We have the emergence of illusion in multiple different ways, right?
Time.
Space
and time automatically involves cycles. And we all know what cycles are. We see day and night and, and 10,000 other cycles. So the emanation of that consciousness on those very high planes, by lack of a better word, we could say that even the law of karma itself is not an abstraction that hangs out there in space. It is represented by those powers. But the condition in which those beings, then, let's use the word beings or entities, maybe even better, in which they exist is, like I said, completely beyond our range of perception. But there must be something that carries the law. And in Theosophy, it is said that a law or a power can only come from beings, she says. So even the law of karma. But to us, it would be a pure abstraction. But it's not an abstraction that hangs out there in space and at some point comes into motion. It is the awakening of beings, of entities. And then they slowly, through emanation, like you said, differentiate in multiple thousands of branches eventually that takes us down to this plane.
Mm. You know, it might be worth saying for people who are listening to this, you know, our culture, we're raised with a very materialistic point of view of our reality. And so Theosophy, Blavatsky points out that Theosophy is technically objective idealism. If you get into philosophy, you'll start to understand what objective idealism means. The idealism part of that comes up with what you talked about with the logos earlier, because another way of referring to that, to what we refer to as the logos, is to use the word mind. So we have, for instance, universal mind, cosmic mind. There's ways of using that terminology. And I think that's important because we have to sort of shift away from a materialistic point of view to understand that at this level, when you're talking about beings or entities, we're not talking about a being standing somewhere on a planet with arms and legs. Like, we're talking about minds at work. And so the consciousness manifests itself through minds that, from our perspective, we would consider those to be gods, right? Because from our perspective, it's a divine kind of consciousness, but those minds themselves are what sort of institute and hold what we refer to as the laws of nature. So the one perception to start getting our own mind around is that everything that we see around us, including all the galaxies and all the stuff, in Theosophy, we would say those exist within universal mind. So that it's within a kind of, from our perspective, and a kind of abstract mind. The space and time that we perceive are occurring inside, so to speak, those entities or beings.
Yeah, you almost have to speak of a container, but it's an infinite container because that container itself is space, which is infinite. I mean, it would be more problematic saying space is finite because then what there's a wall sitting there, but that wall takes up space. What's behind the wall? Well, space. And the wall itself is space too. So by definition, the manifested universe even is infinite. in extension. But of course, you can talk then about, what does that mean, extension? Because that relates also in Theosophy to sensory perception. So, once that you dive into the metaphysics, it can quickly become very complex,
Yeah, and it's kind of, when Blavatsky uses the term space, specifically when she puts the term space in kind of all caps, she's not talking about the extension of 3 dimensions. So in that sense, we're talking about space as a kind of mental construct. Like the collective entities that are initially emanated at that awakening point collectively have a kind of mental space, so to speak, and everything occurs within that.
Yeah, we have a bit of an example of it on our plane because we even use that expression, my mental space. Well, it does not really have extension as such. And that is so close to us that it's real for us. But from the perspective of that high metaphysics, that absolute abstract space, our mental space would be like concrete in comparison.
Yeah.
Because everything is a matter of comparison, of course, in high metaphysics.
Exactly.
Because what seems like a very subtle, HPP says like a noumenon, or you could say a potentiality, can become a phenomenon on any plane. But you can reverse it too, because what is a phenomenon on one plane, for a being on a lower plane, that phenomenon is its noumenon. But for the beings on that plane of the noumenon, to them, that's a phenomenon. But then they also have a noumenon. And you can retreat there until you eventually end up into what you could call the one life, because not because that's a limit, but because you don't know what's beyond that. So that's an important distinction as well.
That's a very important point, because
and that is also that objective
idealism.
And what's the distinct subjective idealism is that, we recognize that we have abstractions, but they're all just in our mind. Whereas in Theosophy, objective idealism means that those abstractions are realities on their own plane. Very important distinction there.
Yeah, exactly. And the objective part of that objective idealism is to say that the substance is real, even if what we are seeing is not the reality of it, because what we're seeing is through sensory perception, which is limited, and so on, right? But it's to say that the idealism part is that everything does occur in mind, so to speak. And so everything that happens, and the substance, the arrangement of the substance into molecules and so on, is a kind of Maya. But it's not that there's no substance per se, which pure idealism would say there's no substance. It's all just a dream.
Yeah.
But Theosophy takes a middle ground there.
Yeah. Otherwise, you couldn't speak of the power to perceive. And, well, what are you perceiving then? Nothing? Well, there's something to be perceived.
Exactly.
So there's something to say for the reality of substance.
Yeah, exactly. So there's 2 other points we should just touch on a little bit more before we take the next step. One is, let's say something about the doctrine of cycles, and the other is a little touch more on what we mean by planes. In Theosophy, we have the term planes, and it's not always clear for newcomers what that means.
Yeah. But before we go there, there's one thing more I wanted to say about the possible existence of beings on higher planes. It's not only in Theosophy that you find it. You find it in virtually all religions, even in Christianity. You call them angels. And also they have their hierarchies of angels. So in the Theosophical philosophy, sometimes HPV refers to angels. She uses that word, but then there is a bunch of Sanskrit and Tibetan words for those higher beings too. And so coming back to the subject that you want to discuss now, that is that idea of cycles. So once that time sets in, it is just not a single stream of motion, so to speak. It has certain qualities, And those certain qualities, those potentialities that manifest themselves are very much connected with cycles. And we all know that word eons that we use on our plane. Oh, that's eons ago. But those eons themselves, like in Gnosticism, for instance, also represent those hierarchies of beings, because beings are not born into a cycle, they produce the cycles. So that puts consciousness in that sense outside of time.
Yeah. Which is a fundamental thing that is different between theosophy and our sort of modern, typical worldview or scientific worldview, is we would say consciousness precedes time, which is in a sense that space and time as we understand them in physics emerge out of a consciousness slash substance unity, right? So the one of the things about cycles that we can understand in theosophy is you need to get your mind around the idea of what emanation means, and the Gnostic system is great for that, right? But when you take an emanational idea, what you're saying is that there is something from which something else emanates, or something emanates from it that becomes distinct from it. And so the real nature of cycles is that there's something that emanates something distinct from itself. That emanation will go out, so to speak, and then come back. So it's not that it's an emanation that goes off forever and becomes eternally something.
Like an uninterrupted, eternal, infinite loop.
Yeah. So everything that is emanated will return to its source as a kind of automatic. You can imagine like something on an elastic band, and you stretch it out and it gets pulled back, and it goes out and it gets pulled back. So cycles in theosophy are kind of from top down, so to speak, from a higher metaphysical state to a lower, from a higher plane to a lower, and back. So the cycles are not just cycles as we experience them, of like spring, summer, fall, winter is an example of a yearly cycle that moves across time. But cycles are emanational in theosophy, so they move from higher plane to lower plane, back to higher plane. And that's fundamental to understanding also the later practical aspects of theosophy, what the path is, and so on. So there's an emanation out, down, or outward, so to speak, and then a return back in or upward.
Yeah. Yeah, it was kind of interesting that you use that word like an elastic band. But there is something to say for the elasticity of time. And you can, depending on your perspective, you could say there is such a thing as physical time, quote unquote, which is seemingly always the same. Our Earth orbits the sun every year in about the same time, give or take a few seconds every year. And that is true for everything that orbits another center. But our psychological experience of that time is elastic. If you're experiencing something that is pleasant, or a movie or something that you're seeing, and you're really involved, like a 2-hour movie is nothing. All of a sudden it's done if you're really focused in it. But if you have to wait for the bus 15 minutes, that's like infinite time sometimes. You're like, when is the bus coming? Jesus, 15 minutes. Whereas 2 hours watching a movie and being focused is like nothing. So there you see that elasticity of time coming in, notwithstanding that the Earth orbits the sun still in 1 year. But how you experience that is psychological. So you could say time is psychological in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's where the objective versus the subjective is really important in theosophy overall. And that brings us back to planes again, because the sort of one of the fundamental perceptions in theosophy about the structure of the reality we experience is that it's composed of what we can call planes. And often you'll hear it expressed as planes of consciousness, or you can say planes of substance, or you can say planes of consciousness dash substance as a so there's different ways that we can express that, but there's the idea of planes, and we normally would imagine in our own mind, or we see diagrams, for instance, of planes from top down. So from more abstract to more concrete, so to speak.
Linear representations. Yeah.
Right. Now, of course, the planes aren't linearly composed in reality. It's not like there's a plane up above us.
If you take a rocket, you're not going to make it to heaven or nirvana.
Yeah. So one idea that we can use to get our mind around planes a little bit is to think of states of consciousness, because we know, for instance, that we're awake right now, and I look out my window and I can see trees and people walking, and there's extension in space and all the laws of physics that we know. I go to sleep and I'm dreaming, and the dream plane, which of course science wouldn't recognize as anything other than things happening in the brain, but in Theosophy, we would say you're sleeping, your experience in dream is on another plane. In that plane, there's extension of space, there's light, there's
Activity.
bodies, there's voice, there's thought, there's all these things exist. But it's not like it's happening when I'm sleeping here. It's not like it's happening in this room or that room or outside here. So it's a different. So in Theosophy, you'd have one plane. The plane above, quote unquote, above that plane has its own dimensional space and time and its own laws of nature and so on and so on.
Sensory perceptions and
different
and so
vehicles
forth,
or bodies that we operate through that have their own means of perceiving. Yeah. And this is a fundamental one that's really weird if you are raised in a materialistic worldview, to imagine that there's another plane that's independent of this one.
There's these two difficult words that we often stumble over. The fact that those planes are not linearly stacked on top of each other, they exist in the same quote unquote location, so to speak. So they all interpenetrate each other, and we refer to that as coadunition. And we often stumble over the grasping of that concept. So they're not consubstantial. They're not of the same substance, obviously, because the substance in your dream is what in Theosophy is referred to as astral substance. But it's not that you moved out of your bedroom and go somewhere in your dream. It's literally a change in state of consciousness. And then there's one beyond, like what we refer to as deep sleep, from which we usually bring back virtually nothing unless you follow a certain path to really extract that information while you're asleep. But that follows a certain path of development and training, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And occasionally it can happen, like what we call an intuition comes on the same level, of course.
Yeah, exactly. So that gives us, I think, we've covered some of the main metaphysics, and once we have the idea of planes in mind, we kind of can have a concept or a conceptual framework of the kind of structure of reality in which we live. Let's move on from there and bring in monads now. So do you want to say something about monads and how that ties into the bigger picture?
Yeah, the monad is very well known from Pythagoras' idea of the monas monadum, the one and only. And from our perspective, since it is so metaphysical, we could say it is infinite potentiality. But again, since a potentiality is also a potential force, that potentiality needs to be carried by entities. But we refer to them as monads. So the Pythagorean monad is the idea that potentiality, infinite potentiality, is universal and exists everywhere. If you want to talk about a three-dimensional space, because that's what we can imagine here, every cubic inch or every cubic millimeter has that Pythagorean potentiality in it. It's sometimes also referred to as the tetractys. And so from that potentiality, as what we earlier referred to, there is an emanation in which elements differentiate themselves. Consciousness and substance differentiate from each other into distinct elements. So it's just like the ocean on the one hand, that's the monas monadum, you could say. And then the drops coming out of it are the monads who in the beginning do not acquire a distinct form yet, you could say. They are a little bit, you can define them a little bit like a mathematical point, which is a body without dimension. Wrap your head around that. Because when you take your pen and you put a period or a point on your paper, and you take a magnifying glass, that's a circle. So here we're dealing with a body that has no extension. And so those are realities in Theosophy. And those are the manifested monads. In the lower kingdoms, those monads are not distinct from each other. So the distinction between monads, when you refer to a mineral monad, a vegetable monad, an animal monad, or a human monad, the distinctions, HPB says, only start to arise in the human kingdom due to that aspect of self-consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Then you can speak of distinct monads, so to speak. But of course, when we say mineral monad, or vegetable monad or animal monad, it's still the same potentiality, but that expresses itself in different forms throughout those kingdoms. So the mineral monad is just the same monad as the human monad, of course, but it has not reached in its development the level of being self-conscious.
Mm-hmm.
On this plane, we have to add that. HPP says that the monad is not self-conscious on our plane. Oh, well, then you mean to say it is self-conscious on its own plane. But then also don't think of that self-consciousness as our self-consciousness on this level. We've mentioned it previously that she says our consciousness on this plane is a brain consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
But the consciousness of the monad, so that potentiality on its own plane, is what you could call or could refer to as universal self-consciousness. And that's an important distinction also that we make in our duality. There's the universal and the individual. That's a construct. The universal is the individual. Think of the Latin meaning of individus. Individual means not divisible. So universal, one life. So on the one hand, the universal is the individual and the individual is the universal. And so it is possible to experience a consciousness of universal self-consciousness. It's what is referred to in meditation. It's one of the highest state possible while still in a body as the self-analyzing consciousness. That's the self-analyzing of the body that has no dimension. Now, when you say a body that has no dimension, you think of something infinitely small, right? But it's also infinitely big at the same time. What's that guy's, the scientist, I forgot his name. He refers to it as well. And he says, it is that which precedes the Big Bang. A scientist saying that. So when you speak of something that is infinitely small, it's the same as saying it is infinitely big because it has no dimension. So yeah, you see how far those metaphysics reach and how deep, and after a while you go like, wow, where are we? You know?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it's a really, it really demonstrates when you start talking about monads, it demonstrates how important it is to have some of those higher metaphysics under your belt a bit, to have some idea of the nature of the higher metaphysics, because that's a framework within which the idea of monads can make sense. The idea of monads might not make sense in a different framework. And so we can think about monads there just as like indivisible units, right? A monad is a unit, and every unit has the potentiality to emerge as a entity or being on any given plane at a specific point or degree of development. So everything is a monad in that sense. Everything we see,
everything is monadic.
Is monadic. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. And when that point that cannot be defined as infinitely small or infinite big, because it is just pure potential. What is potentiality? It's not something that's lying on a shelf or something. It just is. And when it awakes, when those cycles come into play, then eventually beings start to evolve out of it. But don't think of as a human being coming out of it. It has to go through all the kingdoms in order to develop vehicles that can carry that potentiality, which in its expression, as long as it has to go through vehicles, even a divine vehicle, is still a limitation. It has to return back to its origin, so to speak, including its experience that adds then to that infinite potential. But what else can we say? Because, there's nothing to add or to take away from infinite potential, but that's the limitation of language, of how we can refer to it, of course.
And that, like what you're getting into now, is basically the context in theosophy for evolution. So, pure scientific evolution is a strictly physical process by which substance is organized, and that organization over time builds in complexity and so on and so on and so on, right? So it's a purely physical process in that sense. In theosophy, the idea is that actually it's that evolution is that monad, any given monad, going through a process that begins above, so to speak, on a higher plane, descends to lower planes, gathering and developing more coarser vehicles, more strictly organized vehicles, which eventually results in bodies with brains and so on, and then back up an involutionary process. So in theosophy, evolution is part of a pair.
Evolutionary, yeah.
Evolution, yeah. Involution.
Yeah. Well, first, of course, involution. So, let's start it from a different perspective. From the scientific perspective, you start from a kind of 0 point, and it goes higher and higher and higher. But from a theosophical perspective, science starts at the bottom. We start at the top, so to speak, however you want to define that top. So in order to come to the level of development where we are situated now, there are all kinds of metaphysical processes taking place that take us from that potentiality, that monad, the one monad, down involution, down to our physical plane, so to speak. And HPP points out in her secret doctrine that we are the ones now bottoming out on this plane. So once that self-consciousness is established in these type of vehicles that we have, a torso, 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head, then the true evolution, she says, can start taking place. And that means a return towards a more ethereal, abstract existence. In other words, we're getting closer to that original potentiality again. So it's not that in the future there will be more and more limitations. No, it will expand further and further into infinite possibilities of existence. It's an incredible perspective on things, of course.
Yeah, exactly. And I find that theosophy, at least for me, I mean, I was raised with a scientific perspective on evolution. And when I started really studying theosophy, it wasn't a situation where I had to abandon those ideas that I had learned in science about evolution. It actually just provided a larger context for it. Like those ideas that we have in science about evolution, like you say, are covering part of the picture. And there's another part of the picture that those physical processes don't touch because they're metaphysical. And in physics these days, and maybe in the future where physics goes and where biology goes and evolutionary sciences go, that this scientific understanding of it might come together a bit. It might come together a little bit more where you go, okay, well, there's something occurring from the quantum level to the physical level. There's processes that allow physical substance to arise, and there's something that allows that physical substance to be biological, so to speak. And now we have evolution occurring. That's sort of what theosophy does, is provide, at least potentially, a larger context for some of the things that we understand in science and that we know are at least relatively true in science. That they just are there. Some of the things in science we can demonstrate to be true, but they're kind of decontextualized. They're not part of a bigger picture. And Theosophy can fill in some of that bigger picture.
Yeah. HPV points that out in the Secret Doctrine that, of course, she is critical with regard to certain aspects of Darwin's evolution theory. But she says, of course, there is something to say for it, but it's only of secondary, if not tertiary importance, because there is this whole metaphysical involution that precedes physical evolution.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's go from there. There's one thing that we can kind of, it touches back a little bit on what we've been talking about before and provides a bit more context for this idea that now that we're talking about monads, we can bring in the idea of monadic involution and evolution. We are earlier we're talking about planes, so we have this idea that sort of the structure of reality, so to speak, is in planes that are distinct from each other. There's something in theosophy when you get into cosmogenesis, when you get into the how a cosmos, which just the word cosmos means organized, so how a cosmos or a system comes into being. There's ideas in there about what sort of structures exist within those planes. And in theosophy, we have the idea of planetary chains and globes, and it's a very different idea than we find in the scientific idea of astronomy with planets and so on. So can you maybe touch on planetary chains and globes, how they relate to planes, and how they relate to that monadic evolution?
Yeah. Well, in general, and for people who do have a Secret Doctrine, they can look at page 200 in volume 2. You will see a diagram there, and you see 7 planes. And each plane represents a certain stage of, you could say, involution, even. Although the true involution only starts after the 3rd plane of the 7, if you start from the top down. But you also have to keep in mind that that plane, that diagram can be used as a kind of formula. So don't stick yourself to it like it's only applicable to the cosmos or whatever. It's also applicable to ourselves. And so there are different stages of what is referred to as arupa, no form. So the 3 highest planes have no form relative to our conception and perception, because HPB in her transactions points out that for the beings on that plane, to them, she says, it's also substance. So it's not that they're hanging in some kind of abstract space floating around or something. They have their own worlds in those arupa planes. But once we come to what is referred to as rupa planes or planes of forms, that is where evolution starts to differentiate and branch out in what we now today know as our physical world. So in those 4 rupa planes, she says there are different states of consciousness. And by the way, they correspond with our waking state, dream state, deep sleep state, and then even a state beyond the deep sleep state, of which is usually only spoken of in high levels of meditation, the Turiya state. And on each of those planes, she says, the monad evolves, since it is, you could almost say, pure potentiality that expresses itself. Its first vehicle is also a globe, but it is the subtlety of it is such that even a thought on our plane would be like concrete to the existence on that level. And so those 4 planes have, on the first 3 planes, each 2 globes. And then our plane of existence, which is purely physical, is on what we call the physical plane. So in total, you have 7 globes. When you go from the first globe, let's say A, to the last one, you go from A to G, then you have 1 round. And so the whole of evolution for us takes primarily place on those 4 planes, which are different levels of consciousness and different levels of substance. Right now, we are on the lowest globe, on the lowest plane of our system. It's not that the whole universe is divided into 7. You could say that too, if you use it as a formula, of course, but this is specific to our own system, which is, so the sum total of those 7 globes, which by the way are all in coordination, but so the sum total of that is referred to as a planetary chain. And again, when you look at that diagram, you see a linear representation of that, because I can show you one globe and say, look, these are 7 states of consciousness and substance. You know, it's better to represent it in a linear way, because then it also shows you the hierarchical structure of it, which you can't show if I only show you one globe. But there's a limitation on both sides, because we can't see everything in one globe, but we can also not see everything in a linear perspective. So, you know, it takes a bit of mental effort to use that in your imagination. And so the monads run their evolution 7 times, and that is the length of a planetary chain when we go from globe A to globe G, from very ethereal to very concrete, involution, back up to very ethereal. We do that 7 times, and that is the end of our planetary chain, which then in turn also reincarnates. But that's for later.
Yeah, well, and that's perfect, because that sort of brings us, we start getting from the more abstract to the more concrete in our perceptions, because we talked earlier about the doctrine of cycles, that the moment something begins to occur, everything occurs in cycles. And we talked about the emanational idea of that the cycle is really from above to below, back to above, so to speak, or from within to without and back to within. And that's how we see it with the planetary chain idea, is that, you can say a system. So for us, Theosophy is very pragmatic. So it talks about everything for us from our point of view, because that's what's helpful for us. Yeah. So when we talk about the Earth system, so to speak, we're talking about Earth as 7 globes of one unit of 7 globes. The physical Earth that we're on is then the lowest of those 7 globes.
The most coarse.
Exactly. Most coarse, least ethereal, so to speak, of those. Yeah. And so the evolution of the monads that currently belong to the Earth system, or for which the Earth system is the domain of their evolution, run their quote unquote rounds of evolution within this Earth system unit that has different planes of consciousness and substance within it. So it's a bigger picture of evolution, and a bigger picture of astronomy. It's a bigger picture of what a planet represents and what a sun represents. It's a different conception that people are used to.
So it's important that we do not think of those globes as above there somewhere. If you wonder, where are the other 6 globes? Well, they're right here. But you can't perceive them. And then we have to keep in mind, and that's where it becomes really deeper and deeper, that every one of those planes and every one of those globes have their own 7 subdivisions again. And why 7? That is a subject that we can discuss later, because it involves a little bit of algebra, but it's actually quite simple. But there is a reason why it is 7 and not 9 or 11 or 27. But since each one of those planes that all exist in one location, so to speak, has its own 7 subdivisions. Each of those subdivisions has again its 7 subdivisions, and you can extend that until eventually you have all the kingdoms around us, all the minerals, all the, vegetable, animal, human, and so forth. So it's a very elaborate system.
Yeah, and that's one of the nice things about theosophy is that you can start getting your mind around those ideas in broader strokes. So, okay, Earth system, 7 globes. Okay, I can get my mind around that. There's, you could, instead of globe, you could even just say 7 states of evolution, 7 stages of evolution, if you want to.
7 states of consciousness,
yeah,
or whatever.
totally.
Yeah. And of course, keep in mind that's also true for everything else that exists in our physical universe.
Yeah. So there's an Earth chain, or an Earth system that we would refer to as a chain of globes that are all a unit. There's a Venus chain, there's a Mercury chain, there's a chain of the sun. So it's an idea that actually, like, behind the physical planets we see, so to speak, in the same space as those, are other states of consciousness and substance associated with what we see as each of those planets. So we just see the physical representation of those planets, but the physical is just the most outward body, let's say, or the most concrete body of that. So and then you can get more and more and more elaborate in it. But as a newcomer to theosophy, you want to get the first big picture, and then you can start going into further and further detail, of which what we have for theosophy is not a complete picture. So you're filling in some gaps here and there, but then you can also tie some of that into physical evolution, and you can try to bridge the gaps between what you study in theosophy and what you might study in evolutionary sciences, or geology or astronomy or so on, right?
Yeah.
So you can bridge some of those gaps, and then we can go from this bigger picture of monadic evolution through a system or a chain of globes, and we can come down then and get into, okay, what happens on this Earth in terms of evolution and processes. And so there's a couple things maybe you can touch on these. One is the idea of the development of kingdoms. And then the other is the human development, which in theosophy we have terms like root races and such, which represent kind of longer form cycles. So maybe you can touch on those two ideas a bit.
Yeah, of course, in terms of the time that we have, it's just a bird's eye view.
Bird's eye for sure.
But the idea is that the development of that potentiality, which we refer to as monads, which is actually, by lack of a better word, also an entity, that when it evolves, it goes through that idea of involution and evolution, but on each one of those subtle globes, also a whole world needs to be developed, where the concept of space and time are also entirely different from what we experience on this plane. So in order to develop a vehicle that eventually ends up like us in a very core state on this plane, the monad has to cycle several times through all those globes divided over 4 planes. But also on each globe, it has to do the same. So the first thing that it needs to do, HPB says, it skips a few of those metaphysical ethereal planes and ends into the mineral kingdom. So in the mineral kingdom, all the minerals, you could say, are actually precipitated monads. But it's not that the monad itself becomes a mineral. It is the potentiality to give expression by means of the substance that exists there, the homogeneous substance, is then being differentiated through the input of that potentiality or the monads. So they evolve first the whole mineral kingdom, then they evolve the vegetable kingdom, the animal kingdom, and the human kingdom, even on the very first globe in that very first round. But do not expect to see a torso and 2 arms and 2 legs there. It is, you could say, more like a cloud-like or egg-like shaped form. Because, like HPB says it in the Secret Doctrine, the ultimate form of everything in the universe is a sphere. So, or an egg, or a cloud-like appearance. And that is the first thing in which the monads descend. And as they descend lower and lower, each time on every globe, they form those different kingdoms. Once that they reach, they do not all reach the human stage in the very beginning. It takes time, but that gets us into much complexity for the subject. But once it reaches the human stage, like say on our globe, then the monad evolves. She calls that the life wave. That life wave evolves through 7 stages of mental capacity. And those are referred to as root races. Now, mind as we have it developed now existed in that first root race, but not as we know it now. But there was mind as a potentiality, and that potentiality was an activity on its own plane through which those monads recognized their origin. The recognition of that origin we have now with our concrete self-consciousness is lost. We don't know our origin anymore. So, and each one of those stages is referred to as a root race. Okay? So 7 stages of, you could say, actually mental development, from a pure potentiality to a very concrete one that we have now, and further on. And then each of those 7 root races has again 7 sub-races, 7 family races, 7 what
National.
goes.
Sometimes she says national races, or
until you have your family with brothers and sisters and so forth and so forth. See, so but we can get into those complexities later. But what I have just maybe referred to in 5 minutes, one aspect of it, we can talk for days about it.
Exactly. They're very
it's very
broad,
elaborate.
That's the right word. They're very elaborate systems, and that's a really good overview to get us started on it. And all these topics we're going to cover in depth on certain ones in future episodes, and we'll get into that. That's a big one because it really brings us up to our present moment of like how we got to where we are right now. So we'll get into that more, and that's where in Theosophy you get into past developments of human beings, and that ties into scientific too. There was other forms of humans even in scientific evolution and stuff as well. So in Theosophy, there's past, like you said, developments of mind, which go together with different types of bodies that over time. So the whole picture of evolution on Earth in Theosophy ties into scientific point of view of physical evolution, but has a lot more to say in a lot of different ways. So let's go from that and let's touch, we're going to be short on time a little bit. So let's touch on the last few kind of all together. Let's go from that to just a quick overview of how reincarnation and ideas about after-death states ties into that bigger picture of evolution.
In a matter of a few minutes.
In a matter of, let's go a couple minutes on. So we already outlined this idea that, we have this sort of cyclical continuum of evolution that's occurring in waves of monads. Each individual monad then, once they reach the human kingdom, has another kind of cycle that kicks in for them, which we refer to as the reincarnation cycle. So it's a smaller cycle in context of a bigger cycle is maybe the starting point. But go ahead.
Yeah. And well, we, to keep it simple, because everything in a certain sense then reincarnates or returns in one form or another. The question is for us, does our consciousness, our awareness of self, does that reincarnate? Of course, then you have to talk about, but what level of awareness of self? So you could say the highest awareness of self that we are capable of, which is not of a personal nature, that is what reincarnates. The way I know you and the way you know me, that's not going to reincarnate. Even though there may be elements of that remain in existence. That depends on the spiritual quality of the being. So once that monad has reached the human state and has acquired self-consciousness from within itself, so to speak, because it expresses its own potentiality that is, then divided into different levels of what is referred to as Manasaputras and lunar Pitris and, all that thing. But once that we come to our present state and we have self-consciousness, when we die, our physical body obviously dissipates. But there are other elements of our being, because we are also sevenfold, just like our planetary chain. Those other elements of our being, which are referred to as principles or potentialities, you could say, to produce a certain activity, of which we will talk later, the physical body drops away. There is a blueprint that lies at the basis of our physical body, which is referred to as astral. An aspect of that astral also goes away, and another aspect of it, together with our desires, goes into, and our lower personal mind goes into an after-death state, which is referred to as kama-loka. That takes a certain amount of time, which is going to be different for everyone. But the spiritual aspect of ourselves, our true spiritual nature, after a while wakes up in a state that is referred to as devachan, which is like the realm of the gods, you could say, as an expression, because the consciousness is of a very high quality. So there we experience you could say, the spiritual potentialities that we have expressed, but not been able to, well, not express, but that we have given thought to, but not been able to express. All of those go into that state of devachan in which that experience is assimilated. That takes a certain amount of time. And when that is over, the self-conscious entity, without the coloring of the personality, so to speak, reincarnates again on the same earth. Now you could say, why not on another planet? That's the general, the first thing that comes to mind with people. Why back on the earth? Well, that's just like when you are a farmer and you're going to till the soil and you plant your potatoes. When it is time for the harvest, you're not going to another farmer's field. You come back to the same field where you have set your causes in motion. Again, very much connected then with karma. So yeah, we are reincarnating beings, and that is a process that takes a very long time to eventually reach back, until we can reach back up to our original potentiality, and that is referred to then as perfection, including all the experience that we have gained through all these thousands of reincarnations. Right?
Mm-hmm.
That in a nutshell. We can go more
that's perfect.
into that later.
That's a great overview. And you can see in sort of, you used the term assimilation at one point there. When you get into the theosophical view of after-death states and reincarnation, that's where we sort of get the grasp on sort of technically how the evolution of the monad takes place, because there is you can imagine that reincarnation cycle, that we come into the world, we gather all kinds of experience, and then the most spiritual or most
idealistic ideals,
gets assimilated into the character, so to speak, of that unit. And that, so there's a compounding evolution that occurs over time through that process.
And that which actually incarnate is sometimes referred to as the ego on a higher plane. But then you have spiritual ego, you have human ego. Mm-hmm. So is the human ego, the highest aspects of the human ego, that returns. So Pierre or John won't reincarnate, but the spiritual essence of who we truly are, that reincarnates.
Yeah, exactly. And that goes to that idea of, we're all actors on a stage from Shakespeare, right? We're all putting on a different mask each time we come into incarnation, but it's the same underlying entity that incarnates.
And an important element is here that evolution moves forward. We do not reincarnate back as animals or a vegetable or an insect or something. Once human, always human. You may fall back in your state of development to a certain level of humanness, which can be very bad, but ultimately there's always the way forward. We never come back in an animal form. Right?
Which is a fundamental distinction between the Theosophical view of reincarnation and the common Buddhist or Hindu view of reincarnation. The Theosophical view is, I think you could probably just say, progressive reincarnation, perhaps, as a way of sort of clarifying it. There's a progressiveness to that. Okay, we have not much time left, so we're just going to touch on one more thing, and then we'll wrap up, and that gives us a good starting point for a lot of these ideas.
Don't get me started on Atlantis or something.
Yeah. I know. I'm looking closely going, okay, we have this much time left. What can we tackle? But you touched on it a moment ago, and it's critical to understanding the more detailed processes in reincarnation and after death states and all that. And that's the principles of man, or the constitution of man, as you often hear it in Theosophy. So you've touched on earlier that when we think of a planetary system, we imagine in that planetary system for there to be 7 distinctions. And we call them globes on that level. In the human being, we also think of a human being as sevenfold. And that comes out of a sort of the way it's presented to the world generally is you have a spirit, soul, body kind of idea of what a human being is, and then you can expand that out to a kind of sevenfold view. So can you give us just a 5-minute overview of that?
Sure. Of course, we always have to think that no matter of how many principles that we consist, as we are now, we are just one being, one principle, you could say, one human being. But then we know from philosophy and religions that people sometimes refer to as spirit, and the word soul and the body. So it's also something that you find in the philosophy of Plato, and of course in Oriental philosophies. That is, the next step you could take is a very simple one. We are divided into spirit and matter. We're twofold. We have spiritual elements and material elements. So consciousness and vehicles. Then you can expand that duality into a tripleness. You can say there is the spiritual potentiality, there is the expression of that through an ethereal vehicle, which you can call soul. And that soul on our plane needs a physical vehicle, which we call body. Then you can further the physical bodies, let's take that at the bottom. And now we're going to go from 3 to 7, and you stick spirit at the very top, that infinite potentiality that exists in us. It bottoms out in a physical body. So in between, we have 5 other levels. You can divide that into soul, different levels of soul, spiritual soul, human soul, and animal soul. And then the human soul itself can again be subdivided into higher and lower aspects, depending on our ethical qualities, for instance. But fundamentally, we are sevenfold. We have spirit. That's the Sanskrit word atma, that our infinite potentiality, that needs a vehicle to manifest itself through, buddhi. But functionally, buddhi then becomes also the vehicle of wisdom, you could say. But they're both the monadic, the atmic, and the buddhic. They are both still universal. In order to individualize itself, it needs a distinct mind from other people. That's our third vehicle down, or principle down. But that mind needs to function on the physical plane under certain conditions. So in order to expand an activity, it needs desire. In order to live, it needs life. And in order to have a physical body, it needs a blueprint. And those three we call in Sanskrit kama, desires. We are driven by desires in our life. We also have a life aspect, which is referred to in Sanskrit as prana. And we also have a blueprint aspect, for which usually the word astral is used. Keep in mind that all these principles also have, again, their own 7 subdivisions. Okay? So we have spirit, spiritual soul, human soul, desires, life, blueprint, astral body, and physical body. And that gives us 7 principles. So it's very hard to say, just leave like we are now, as we exist now, leave just one of them out, and the whole thing implodes. See? There's no necessity to add something more there, because those 7 are complete. And we'll come back later to why that 7 is complete.
That's perfect. And that touches into what you said earlier, the difference between distinction and separation. There's distinctions, but none of these principles are separate from one another.
Not separate.
They're ways of understanding the totality and ways in which that totality operates in action.
You could say 7 different functions of activity. Mm-hmm. Can say that too.
Yeah, exactly. And then when we get into, when you get into the weeds of reincarnation and after death and all of that, then you can start understanding that in the context of those principles. Which principle gets dropped off, which vehicle carries on, and so on and so on. So it's a way of looking at a human being that allows us to conceptualize some of these processes in a more detailed way.